Welcome to the Plant-Based Podcast. Did you know that plants are truly amazing? Not only can you grow them and eat them, you can also wear them, drink them, nourish your skin with them, and so much more. Let Ellen and Michael inspire you to love plants as much as they do, as they chat with the movers and shakers in this wonderful plant-based world. So, let's dig in.
Hi everyone, it's Ellen Mary here. I am hosting today's episode in one of the Wellbeing Specials that I'm doing. So that's 4 episodes over the course of 8 weeks. And the other 4 weeks are, of course, Michael with his very special plant breeding episodes. So today in this lovely episode, it's all about well-being and dose gardening. Yeah, have you ever heard of dose gardening? So I'm speaking to Dr. Lauriane Chalmin-Pui from the RHS, and she was leading up amazing research into how dose gardening affects our well-being. You can find out more about what all that means throughout the episode. And it really got me thinking, I go out gardening a lot, and the word dose tends to be linked to medication, from the doctors, like take your dose of medication. So can I overdose on gardening? I'm really hoping not. Because if so, I'm well and truly overdosed. This is a really fascinating conversation that I've had with Lauriane, and I really hope that you thoroughly enjoy it. It's about how to get the most out of your time in the garden for your own well-being. And I definitely took away some tips, and I've been focusing much more on my physical and mental health well-being whilst I garden, not just gardening in a rush, this has got to be done, I must hurry up and get that done. It's okay, just enjoy it while you're outdoors. It doesn't have to be perfect. I think that's a really, really important point to make. Your garden is your garden. You enjoy it however you like. It does not need to be perfect. But make sure you get your dose of it no matter what you do. And one more thing before we get into the episode. Michael and we are going to be walking 20 miles. Yes, that's 20 miles for The Feed, which is a charity based in Norwich. They help provide food for homeless people and so much more. It's an incredible charity. Please look up The Feed. We're going to be doing the walk in Norfolk on the 16th of September. Neither of us have ever walked 20 miles before. Well, I certainly haven't. Actually, I don't know about Michael. I hope he's got the right shoes though. So we're going to be doing this walk with Chris Elliott, who works at The Feed and who's organised it. And we would so appreciate your sponsorship. It's a big walk. I'm going to be taking plasters, believe me. We want to raise awareness of homelessness, poverty, and also education about food too, where our food comes from. Supplying food to people in poverty is what The Feed does. It's really important. It's something I'm very, very passionate about. So we would really appreciate your sponsorship. Please keep your eye on our social media at the Plant-Based Podcast. That's Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, of course, for more information. And in the meantime, I hope you enjoy your dose of gardening.
On today's podcast episode, our guest is Dr. Lauriane Chalmin-Pui, who has been leading a research program on the influence of gardens and gardening on our health and well-being. Find out what dose gardening is, what the key findings were in the recent research, and what the future holds for gardening and well-being. You'll also get some tips of how to get the most out of your time in your garden for your own mental and physical health well-being. I'm really looking forward to chatting with a doctor on the show. Welcome to the podcast, Lauriane.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We really appreciate you spending the time with us to talk about the research that you've done recently. Basically, we usually start the podcast with asking our guests where it all started, where your interest in gardening and well-being started. So can you tell our listeners how it all began for you?
Yeah, I think it was quite accidental in a sense. I think I started off being interested neither in gardening or in well-being. I have always been interested though in how we as individuals and as sort of communities and societies relate to the environment around us. I moved a lot as a child to different countries, and I always really enjoyed that exposure to new environments and different environments. And I studied geography at university, and there I found that a lot of what we were being told about how the world is, there was always this distinction between nature and urban, so natural areas and urban areas. And as someone who's always lived in cities, in big cities, I didn't really understand that, because I had seen nature in the big cities, not a lot of it, and obviously not in the same way as you find in a national park, for example. But I really always wanted to, I was sort of just very curious about the urban bits of nature and the natural bits of urban areas. And that's when I started looking at weeds growing on pavements. I was also interested in zoo animals. So they're, natural, but I mean, they're part of nature, but in urban areas and not your kind of wild nature. And then essentially gardens were just another form of urban nature. And that's how I got into gardens, and a way of valuing gardens in a way that they weren't previously valued before was looking at the health and social aspects.
That's really interesting, especially that you mentioned even like zoo animals. They are nature at the end of the day, aren't they? But yeah, of course, they're in an environment that you would not ideally want to see them in, I suppose. You want to see them out there. But you also mentioned about weeds. Like, I love seeing a weed popping up through the pavement cracks. So, if you're walking around a city, I remember reading something that was about plant blindness, where lots of people, what they can see around them and whatnot, and they would mention the building or a car, but they wouldn't mention the plants that were growing or the trees. So I specifically look now, if I'm in a city, I'm looking at where nature is at. So I love that your fascination with that has enticed you into kind of studying it and researching it further as well. So you then, what have you studied? Because you're a doctor, I feel very academically sad with myself when I speak to a doctor. I'm like, okay, I love plants, but you've researched this, you've done so much work and so much study. Tell us about your studies.
So after geography, I did a master's in environmental policy, and there I was interested, I suppose, on a more national and even international scale at what we can do to have a positive impact on our environment. And as I mentioned, I was interested in different forms of nature. And then I got to PhD level. I didn't really know what a PhD was really, or why I didn't think I sort of knew that I wanted to do a PhD. I didn't really set out on that path. But this opportunity arose to look at the impacts of front gardens on human well-being. And that was perfect for me to kind of latch onto, because it's nature literally on our doorstep. And I thought there might be quite very personal relationships with front gardens that are not necessarily on a neighborhood scale or on a national scale. And I went into it thinking it was a very small scale. And I think also because I'm not a gardener, and I definitely wasn't a gardener at the time when I set out, I thought I was looking at it, from a very objective sense. Okay, so, who are these gardeners that I'm studying that have front gardens, or that don't have that don't have plants, in their front gardens?
Who are these people?
Yeah, it was a new objective study in a sense, from that very outsider perspective. And I spent 3.5 years of my PhD trying to understand that, and that's where I got to these different studies, of one of them looking at the frequency of gardening, one of them looking at an intervention where we paved over previously their front gardens with plants and then looked at the before and after effects on these residents. I say we, so that was me and my PhD supervisors, Alistair Griffiths, Ross Cameron and Jenny Rowe. And that was fascinating for me, because it was this whole new world into gardeners who, I mean, so the people who were already gardeners, they were all telling me, well, why are you researching this? We already know this, for ourselves. And I think that was very interesting, because it also meant, in a sense, that they thought the research could be biased, because they thought that I'd put in my own kind of experience as a gardener and, any positivity that might come from there. So it was quite interesting to find them reassured that I wasn't a gardener, in a sense. But also, ultimately, the value of the evidence that we now have is not so much for the gardeners, because they know, or it's more for people making funding decisions, or boards making planning application decisions, things like that, where we've now actually got the evidence on the table of how to value these spaces that are increasingly endangered, in a sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And how gardeners like the unbiased approach, because when I go out gardening, I've obviously been a gardener for many years. I know it makes me feel good. I know if I don't have, like, I've got a really small front garden in the city, it's like a little patch, but it's just full of plants. If that wasn't there, I know how unhappy I would feel. I know how happy it makes me feel. I know when I've been gardening out there and I come indoors and I feel like a sense of satisfaction, and I feel kind of more buoyant for doing it. So it's actually really interesting for the research to have come from someone who just isn't a gardener at all. Like, this is all new. Like, who are these crazy people out there gardening in all weathers? Why does that scruffy looking plant, make that person feel amazing? I think that's really, really interesting. And I did read the research, which we will come on to in a moment. And I thought also that it hugely backs up, like, the social and therapeutic horticulture movement as well. I say movement, social and therapeutic horticulture has obviously been in practice forever, but we've kind of lost that link. We kind of don't use it necessarily for well-being as much, and I feel like that's being changed a bit more now in recent years. So that this research kind of goes hand in hand with that as well, with social prescribing and kind of thing. Interesting though, I was saying to somebody, it's National Allotments Week this week, and I was saying how important that it is. We celebrate each other's allotments, of course, but also that land is available for people to grow on, both for food security, for community, but for well-being as well. And somebody commented on that and just said, all these new housing estates that go up, or tall apartment blocks in urban areas, or indeed even in rural areas, they don't necessarily have land that's available for growing your own food, for example. And so when you just said about this research can also is useful for funding and for urban planners and planners in general, this is really useful, isn't it? Because they can look at that and say, we can actually make this space something that's really good for people's health as well as a nice home. It isn't just about your home being lovely, is it? It's about that land outside as well. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, in terms of these new developments, there is, of course, always going to be that balance between maximizing the number of homes and households and affordable homes. But then there is that next question of, those people who are going to live there. How are they going to live? And there's often, I feel sometimes in a lot of these kind of webinars or whatever about how you can kind of increase well-being in your life, it's always about, okay, how can you integrate greenery into your daily life, into our modern urban busy lives? But I think one thing that I've realized more and more is more, I think it's the flip question. So how can we afford to not live without that greenery nearby? Because we're seeing all these, huge rises in mental health issues. I mean, there's going to be a reckoning after COVID as well. I think that's already started. There's child psychiatrists who are saying that the incidence of eating disorders and attention disorders in children is already, they're already seeing that impact from people being locked down, and of course for good reason. But if they're being locked down in homes with no access to green space, then that's going to have an impact.
Yeah, that's interesting. I love what you just said as well. How can we afford not to live without this greenery? That's key, isn't it? Like you said, we always look at it from the other way around. Okay, so before we get into your role at the RHS and really a bit more in detail with regards to the research that you've done, do you now, coming from someone who wasn't at all into plants or gardening, are you more so now?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I bought first cactus. I think it was about 3 months into my PhD. Yay. I did feel I should. Unfortunately, that one hasn't quite survived. But no, I've since got. I think I've probably got about 9 or 10 houseplants now. So I've never had my own outside growing space. Always living in various flats. But yeah, I've definitely got the houseplants, and I mean, they're definitely part of my routine, and I think I probably always will have some. So I think I do see. I think with houseplants, you probably don't get, as much of the physical activity benefits. So I do that otherwise, but definitely I do get that sense of nurturing something that is actually responding back to you, whether that's positively or negatively. When you come back and they look a bit neglected, you do kind of feel that they're happy to see you again.
I think so too. I think my plants pine for me when I'm not here.
Yeah, but I think it's also one interesting thing. It's actually connected me on a certain level with some family members, for example, that I never really talked to with plants before. Well, it turns out they're gardeners. I never really realised that. So now I can share, if I've got a new bloom or something, I pass on the photo. So it has created new connections for me. Having said that, a lot of my friends, childhood friends, are absolutely not gardeners either. They don't have the growing space. They have fairly nomadic lifestyles sometimes, so it's not always easy to kind of keep a place. You move your belongings around. So they always find it quite funny that I'm now, the expert on front gardens.
I love the view though, because you are coming at this, as we've said a couple of times before, with that unbiased view. I find it really hard to do this research because I'm like, well, I know it makes me feel good. I don't like all the stats and everything else is like, but of course it makes me feel good. So I think this is a really good way of approaching it. But if you've got about 10 houseplants, you are now officially green fingered. So, it's only a matter of time before you end up with a garden or a balcony. It does to all of us eventually. So let's talk about your role at the RHS. What's your role there currently? What are you doing?
So it's called Wellbeing. So I'm a Wellbeing Fellow. It's the first time, I'm quite sure it's the first time that the RHS has employed a scientist to study humans. So looking at the impact of gardens on human well-being. So I'm part of the science team at Wisley, and I am also remain affiliated to the University of Sheffield, where I did my PhD. So in a sense, it's a fully research position with links to Sheffield, as I mentioned. And the difference, in a sense, is that in my PhD, I've found the positive impacts of front gardens, and also some findings on domestic gardens in general, not only front gardens. And now what I'm looking to research is, and what I've started doing, is opening that kind of black box of, okay, so people have a garden, they go into the garden, and then they kind of come out and feel better. But, what's going on in there? What are they doing? What have they seen? What have they interacted with? And that's, of course, not just going to be plants. And it's not just going to be greenery, because, of course, we've got lots of different colours, we've got lots of different textures, we've got lots of different fragrances. So I'm trying to unpick those multisensory aspects that I'm sure will have different impacts on how people feel. We know that scents are extremely evocative. They are processed in the same part of the brain that processes emotion and memory. So they're quite intimately tied. And I think that will be, of course, kind of different for each individual, but may also be imbued with sort of cultural associations. But I wonder whether there are certain smells that are just either more restorative or that lead to different kind of emotional responses. And that then translates to well-being or mental health. Because generally, if you're feeling down for about 3 hours, that's quite normal, that's quite human. And then, you find something that will pick you back up, you get on with life. But if you're feeling down for about 3 weeks, that becomes more of a problem. And so it's that kind of accumulation of either positive or negative emotions that will have an impact on your well-being as well. And yeah, if you're spending, half an hour or 1 hour or 4 hours in the garden, what are these stimuli that you're getting? And it's hard because there's so many factors that are difficult to control for, but that's the plan.
Wow, it's like, the research into what colours bees like, for example. It's kind of like that, what smell do humans like most, or, what attracts them to that particular colour or scent. So that's super interesting.
Yeah, that's the perfect analogy, because we know kind of ecologically on that plant physiology level how to encourage bees, how to encourage butterflies. If you say you want to plant a wildlife garden and you want XYZ wildlife, probably someone can tell you not necessarily a given plant list, but what kinds of plants or what kinds of features the plants you'd need. We don't have that equivalent evidence base for how we can optimize human well-being.
Oh, but we might do in a few years when you've done your research. Hopefully. We're all banking on you. It's funny, isn't it? Because I think we individually do particularly head towards a certain scent, something we just might remind us of, I don't know, a relative or a situation or somewhere that we've been. But it would be really interesting if there is like a commonality between all people and certain scents and colours or textures. So I'm really looking forward to finding out about that, as you progress along that. Recently, the research was released about the paper that you'd been working on to do with the dose effect of gardening. And by the way, I absolutely love that term, dose effect. It's brilliant. Can you explain what that's all about, what the research was all about, when you started it? How did you go about it? What was it all about?
Yeah, so this came out of my PhD, and essentially what I wanted to do in the early days of setting, my research questions and what my methods were, I wanted to see whether people who gardened in their front garden had higher levels of well-being or lower levels of stress than people who didn't garden in their front garden. Set about doing an online questionnaire, so it would all be self-reported, but there are established scales that can measure that perceived stress and perceived mental well-being. And in formulating the questionnaire, I realized that this was actually, you can't really separate people into gardeners and non-gardeners. So you'll have gardeners who garden every day, who, that's their whole life. And then you'll have gardeners who garden because they just need to maintain the house or because they want to maintain the house. And then, what's a non-gardener? It could be someone else who just doesn't garden, but if you have a garden and you kind of garden once a month. So basically it was just so difficult to separate this out. I couldn't have two categories. So I decided to just ask people, how often first of all, do you consider yourself a gardener or not? And then next question, how often do you actually garden on average across the seasons? Because obviously it will be different depending on the time of year. And And so that essentially filtered out my categories. And that's where I could then in the analysis look at dosage in that sense, where people told me that they either gardened every day or 2 or 3 times a week, or once a week, or 2 or 3 times a week, or once a month, or never. I mean, funnily enough, there were some people who told me they were gardeners who never gardened, and then there were some non-gardeners who gardened every day. But there was ways of getting around those categories. And of course, then I realized I couldn't just make a questionnaire like this about front gardens. So I also decided to include back gardens, community gardens, allotments, side gardens. Some people told me they had, or if they just gardened in a different space. So I ended up having all that data. So it wasn't limited to just front gardens, but we were able to have these different groupings of people. And yeah, when we looked at the data, the people who were gardening every day, whether or not they called themselves a gardener, were also reporting higher levels of mental well-being and lower levels of stress than the people who were gardening just 2 or 3 times a week. And then that, again, those people gardening 2 or 3 times a week were having higher levels of well-being than the people gardening less often than that.
Isn't that remarkable, actually? How many people took part in the research?
6,015.
Right, that's quite a lot, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, and then this all went into assessing like a well-being score. Is that right? Or a percentage increase depending on how many times you garden? How does that work?
Yeah, so the scale we use is the Warwick and Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale, the short version of that. So that is, I might be wrong, I believe it's 7 items. Okay. So it will ask you, like, in the past week, how on top of things have you felt? So kind of positively worded questions about your mental well-being. And that gets then, you get a score out of 35. So from 7 to 35, 35 being high well-being and 7 being low well-being. So a score of 35 is better than a score of 7. And then we can see the differences between the average score for the people who are gardening every day and the average score for people gardening at different frequencies.
It's amazing. And so the research is now out there. Who do you hope to kind of influence with that research? Is it the public? Is it planners? Who is it that you want that to kind of really hit home with?
For me, I think it's about getting the different sectors to talk to each other. So if we have the horticulture sector, I mean, surprisingly, the horticulture sector doesn't necessarily always value horticultural spaces for its health benefits. Then there's the health sector, who obviously do lots and lots of great things for us, but those dots aren't connected to green spaces, not in the medical sense. So there might be some public health understanding that parks are good for us, and that's, historical understanding. But that doesn't kind of translate to the modern day health and social care systems, not quite yet. And then there's the urban planning sectors, the kind of even construction, development, as we were talking about earlier on. And I think all of these sectors, whether that's in kind of industry or academia or, consultancies or whatever, they're all, of course, having to do their day jobs. But I think that there needs to be some joining of the dots, where often, like in planning jargon, green spaces are called amenity space, but we're not quite sure what that amenity is really for. And it's about understanding how, I think it really can just be a win-win situation of providing, quality green space, equitable access to everybody. And then that can be used for recreation, whatever. It can also be used as health interventions. And that should really, so that kind of, let's say, urban planning should be part of a longer term public health strategy. And I think we're just not yet there. And so I think that's the kind of higher level ambition. of course, it's also important to communicate that, to an individual level, because if people don't understand that this could actually be good for them, if you went to the doctor because you are feeling extremely lonely, and the doctor, and I don't know, let's say you're expecting some sort of medication, or let's say maybe you have depression and you're expecting medication, and the doctor tells you to just go for a walk in the park, you're gonna feel completely not listened to at all, as if they're minimizing your problems or whatever it is. It might be quite patronizing. Whether or not you then have the means to do that walk in the park is a different story, but really it should be kind of encouraging that. But I think also, if we can communicate to people that gardening or kind of nature-based physical activity could have some real health benefits for them, then they're also maybe more likely to trust that. And of course, the doctor themselves needs to be convinced that this is an appropriate solution for their patient. So it comes on different levels. But yeah, as we talked about, I think most gardeners probably, it wouldn't really change much for them because they kind of knew it already.
Sure. It's like a big circle, isn't it? And just joining all the dots, like between urban planning and space that's available for everybody, no matter where, urban, deprived areas, everywhere needs to have access to this outside space in some respect. I work with a community garden in the city, in Norwich City, where I'm based. And one of the key motivations of the team at the garden is to help with loneliness. We know that locally there's many people living both in poverty and on their own. And so the garden is open, in order to encourage people to have a sense of community and, yes, get some physical activity, but also to improve mental health well-being. And throughout COVID, we had to close the garden for just a very short period last year, but otherwise it was open because it is an outdoor space. And afterwards, we done some survey and chatting with some of the more regular people who came to the garden. And it was incredible just how much that very small garden improved people's well-being and improved their feeling of isolation throughout COVID. So it is really important to have these spaces available and important for everybody, no matter where they live. Just one more thing about the research, if you don't mind. Was there anything within the research, like a key finding, that really surprised you? Was there something that you weren't expecting to come from it?
Just to go back to that other research study that I think I mentioned earlier on about adding plants to the bare front gardens, and we looked at people before and after, their physiological stress and their psychological stress. I didn't think that the intervention would have a negative impact. So I didn't think that people would just be miserable after I'd added plants. To be frank, I thought, there'd just be no change. We were just adding 2 containers of ornamental plants, a small tree for those that we could lift a flagstone for. And it was just really surprising that adding just that small quantity of plants had that positive impact on an individual's stress regulation. So patterns of cortisol, which is the body's main sort of stress response hormone. They were healthier after the intervention, after 3 months of adding the plants. And same, I just didn't imagine it to be such a clear-cut story, to be such an easy story to tell and to share with people. Right. And I mean, one thing that I guess I never really thought about too much, but the fact that for the dose response, going back to that one now, the fact that it was just going up and up, it's not like the people who are gardening every day were more because sometimes you can overdose on things, right? You can do it too much, it kind of overconsumes you. And of course, there will be people that, I've spoken to plenty of people that actually their garden causes some stress in their lives. It's an extra chore they have to do. They're not necessarily on top of things. But in that data of the 6,000 people, there didn't seem to be that impact even of, you know, something plateauing off, where gardening every day was actually having showing signs of being correlated with even higher well-being than just 2 to 3 times a week. And obviously not everyone's going to have the time to garden every day, but it was just quite surprising that it did.
Yeah, it's incredible that you don't need much. You like you said, you just a couple of pots and perhaps a tree. That makes so much difference. During lockdown last year, I was in North Carolina in America. We had a little balcony, and that balcony saved my COVID days. I will never forget it, because without that tiny little outside space and just a few pots, I honestly think I would have struggled so much more. And the person living next door has a little balcony, same size. And he used to come out onto his balcony, look over at ours. And one day he said to me, you know what? He said, I think I'm going to have to get some plants for my balcony. I was like, sure, go for it, you know. And he had a small pot of violas. And he used to go outside and water this little pot every day. And then the next thing was he'd got some furniture, and he used to sit outside there, and he put this pot of violas like on the table in between these two little chairs. And he on numerous occasions mentioned to me how pleased he'd got this little pot of violas. It's one pot of sunny yellow violas, but that genuinely made him happy, and it made him want to go and sit outside more, you know. And so your research is completely backing up that feeling that he had, you know, just from a really small number of plants.
Yeah,
that's incredible. So you don't even need a big garden. You just need some plants in your life.
Yeah,
I love that. So you already mentioned the research you're moving on to now, which is really interesting. Definitely can't wait to see where that goes. But before we finish up on today's podcast, so do you have any tips for listeners to get like the most out of their garden when they're outside, spending time outside? What can they do in order to kind of like help their own well-being?
I mean, well, listeners would probably know much more about gardening than I would, so I'm not going to share any gardening tips. But I think that according to all the theories about why gardening has these positive impacts, it kind of comes down to a couple of different things, where the kind of activities that we're doing, if they are kind of fairly easy, repetitive tasks that you don't have to, you know, they're not too cognitively demanding. So something like weeding or sowing seeds, that it's quite kind of mechanical, and you're just repeating that movement over and over again. That kind of puts us into a state of flow, whereby you can actually either completely zone out on, let's say, whatever problem you're mulling over, or the fact that you're doing that will actually help you process it and, you know, make maybe better decisions about how to go about it. So activities that really take your mind away from focusing on yourself. So that could be something, as I said, quite repetitive, or you might be just watching and observing. So you could be you know, spending, I mean, it might seem a long time, but even just 30 seconds, for example, you know, looking at the shape of a fern or something like that, can actually be really fascinating, and just removes your focus away from yourself, and you're kind of distracted by the things around you. So I guess it's a lot about being present in the moment of whatever you're doing, and surrounding yourself with I mean, ultimately things that you like, you know, fragrances that you like. As you mentioned, if you really don't like lavender, then don't plant lavender just because everyone else says they like it. And plant the chocolate cosmos that you want to smell. You know, it's
lovely. Yeah.
So I think it's really about creating that space for yourself, and then really being in it, I suppose. But that's probably not new for anybody, but it is backed up by the theory.
It's always good to reinforce that. I think, you know, we can all go to the garden, and especially when we do garden a lot, if you have like an allotment like I do, my allotment's my haven. But also sometimes when I go there's things that need doing, and I'm like, oh gosh, you know, that I should have done that weeks ago. And so it can partially make you feel a bit stressed. But I'm over that now, because I genuinely feel like your space is your space. It should be however you want it to be. Don't pressure yourself for it to have to be perfect or on time. Just enjoy the moments that you are there. And like you were saying, just stopping and observing something just really chills you out, academic level, just how I feel about it. I can stop and just watch a bee buzzing on a buddleia, and I can feel my blood pressure lower. I can feel my shoulders kind of relax, and even my jaw, because your jaw tenses up so much if you're stressed or in a rush or you've got things on your mind, like everything just relaxes. And so I think, that advice is, always good to reinforce it, even if we all think we know it. We're still guilty sometimes of not doing it. So thank you for that. And also, what about if someone doesn't have a garden? What can they do?
Well, I suppose that's like me. So you can definitely get houseplants. There's also, I think the allotment waiting lists are probably, really, really long. But you can, it depends, like look up your local area. There might be a community garden you can join. I know where I am, there's a community group that plant up the railway station beds. So there's little things like that you can just kind of get involved with if you want that kind of exposure, and you definitely don't need any experience. I know that firsthand. Equally, I think get a pack of seeds and just sow them, on a road verge or something. You probably get a bit less feedback unless it's very close to your house or something. But I think there's definitely something to be said for also that kind of wilder aspect of nature that you're not kind of mothering over, and that you can still plant something for the future.
Yeah, I love that. And leaving a legacy also, isn't it? You're helping the wider environment and encouraging kind of biodiversity wherever you live, with a little bit of guerrilla gardening. I love that. Throw some seeds down in the cracks of the pavement or something, and then walk on by every day and watch them grow and see that you've contributed. And one day you might see a bee or a butterfly enjoying it, and that makes you feel like, you've made that happen, you've helped. Yeah. And I think that all contributes to a sense of great well-being. So, okay, so thank you so much for being on the podcast. I have one last question for you, and that is mainly from a selfish perspective. Can I overdose on gardening?
I think probably any kind of addictive behavior needs its controls, doesn't it? No, I've not come across anything majorly bad, but and that's certainly not coming across in the data. So probably not from the mental health perspective, at least I don't think. But it's all about balance, isn't it? And we need, generally there's 5 ways to well-being that the New Economics Foundation sort of developed, and they were, I don't know if I'm even going to get them all right now, but they were to physical activity, to kind of be aware of your surroundings, so take notice, be active, that was one of them. Then there was give, so that is, giving of yourself to others or to the wider world. I feel like I'm probably going to forget what all the others are. But my point is, you can get all of these you can get so many aspects of well-being in a garden, but there's also other things, like you've got to kind of connect. That was one of them. Of course you may be connecting with people in your community garden or all of that, but if you are always just in your own private garden, you might be lacking some connection with family or friends or neighbors or whatever it is. So it's all about balance, I think. But for sure, if you find the thing that works for you, then that's amazing, because lots of people haven't found it.
Yeah, that's very true, and that's very good advice. Also, it's all about balance, and I do always joke that I'm a complete plant addict. I am obsessed with plants, but I'm actually not gardening all the time every day. There are other things that really satisfy me as well. I love the theatre and I love music, and I love being with my friends as well. So I think you're absolutely right. Well-being is like it's a a whole host of things that makes you feel good. But it is amazing to know that gardening, of course, is one of them. And so I really appreciate you coming on the podcast, telling us all about that. I'm sure our listeners will really enjoy this episode. It's great just to see that there's research being done. I'm very slightly envious of you being able to work at Wisley, because it's one of the most beautiful gardens absolutely in the whole of the UK, if not anywhere. So yes, you definitely do get your dose of at least plants and being outside and being around people who love plants, that's for sure. So thank you very much for being on the podcast. We very much appreciate it. And I hope that you enjoy nurturing your own house plants at home as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
The music for the Plant-Based podcast is part of the song Grow by Mikey James, and our editor is Gareth Patch of Semi Echo.